There's a moment that happens in certain conversations. Someone younger is talking, confidently, quickly, explaining how something is going to go, a business, a relationship, a decision. The person across from them, somewhere in their 50s, is listening, nodding, not interrupting, but something is happening behind their eyes, not arrogance, something quieter, something that looks almost like watching a movie they've already seen and knowing exactly which scene comes next. They don't say anything. They let the conversation finish. They might even smile, ask one careful question, then change the subject. Later, driving home alone, they think, I already knew how that was going to end. I've seen this exact thing before. Not once, many times. And then the second thought, the one they almost never say out loud. I'm not sure I could explain how I knew. I just did. That feeling, quiet, certain, impossible to fully describe, is what this is about. If you're somewhere in your 40s, 50s, or 60s, there's a good chance you felt it, too. Gen X knows. What they've carried since before anyone thought to ask them is something other generations are still in the process of learning. The psychology behind it is more interesting than most people realize. But we need to start at the beginning, at the specific conditions that built this kind of knowing in the first place. Because it didn't come from books. It didn't come from school. It came from something much harder to name than that. Think about what it meant to grow up in America between 1965 and 1980. The boomers before them inherited a country that was expanding, economically, culturally, in every direction. Optimism wasn't just a feeling, it was the evidence. The economy said so, the institutions said so, culture said so. Gen X grew up watching that optimism start to develop cracks, not loudly. The cracks were quiet at first. A father who came home from work looking different than he used to. Neighborhood where 3 houses on the same street had for sale signs within a year. Television news cycle that slowly started to feel less like information and more like something else, something being managed. They were children. They didn't have the vocabulary for any of this. They were watching, and what they were watching without knowing it was the first of many lessons in the gap between how things are presented and how things actually are. Gap between the surface and the reality underneath became the defining education of a generation. There's a man named Thomas. He's 58 now, works in construction management in the Midwest. Grew up in a small Ohio town where the steel plant was the center of everything, the economy, the social life, the identity of the whole place. He was 11 when he first noticed something was wrong. Not the plant. Something in the men who worked there. A quality in the way they talked to each other at the diner, after church on Sunday mornings. A particular kind of careful language. The way certain topics got changed before they were finished. He didn't say anything. He was 11. But he kept watching. 3 years later, the plant announced layoffs, then more layoffs, then closure. The community was devastated. People used the word shocked. They said nobody saw this coming. Thomas had seen it coming. Not the specifics, not the dates, but the shape of it, the feeling of it, the unmistakable quality of a story that is ending before anyone has said it out loud. He's been reading those shapes his entire life since then. Think about what that kind of early education does to a person over 50 years. Every time the gap appeared, between what was said and what was true, between the official story and the thing happening underneath it, the capacity grew. The pattern library expanded. The recognition became faster, more certain, less explainable. The time these people were in their 30s, they had accumulated something that no formal education could produce. Pew Research Center has tracked generational differences in institutional trust for decades. Their findings are striking. Gen X adults show the lowest levels of institutional trust of any living generation, lower than boomers, lower than millennials, lower than Gen Z. They're statistically the least likely to take things at face value. The most likely to notice the detail that doesn't fit. This is not cynicism. This is earned pattern recognition. Here's what most conversations about Gen X miss entirely. That pattern recognition doesn't just apply to institutions. It applies to everything, to people, to relationships, to rooms, the first 30 seconds of a conversation, to the sentence someone almost says and then doesn't. There's a woman named Carol, 53, has been a nurse for 27 years. She describes something that happens when she walks into a patient's room for the first time. Before she reads the chart, before she asks a question, before the patient says a word, she already knows something. Not everything, but something. She knows whether this person is frightened or in denial, whether the pain they're describing is the real pain or the acceptable version of it. The story they're about to tell her matches what she's seeing in their face and their hands and the way they're holding the sheet. She can't fully explain how she knows. She just does. Her younger colleagues sometimes ask her how to develop that. She doesn't have a great answer. Because the honest answer is, you can't accelerate it. It comes from 10,000 moments of being in the room, paying attention, filing away what matched and what didn't, building a library of human reality that exists below the level of language. 27 years of that library. That's what she knows that other generations don't. The American Psychological Association has a name for this. They call it experiential wisdom, a specific form of knowing that develops through repeated exposure to complex, ambiguous, often contradictory real-world situations. It's different from intelligence, different from education, different from emotional sensitivity, though it draws on all three. It's what happens when someone pays close attention to difficult reality for long enough that the patterns become visible before the evidence is complete. Gen X didn't choose this, but they developed it anyway, because the world they grew up in required it. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. Gallup organization tracks what they call intuitive accuracy, the ability to make correct judgments about people and situations based on incomplete information. Their research consistently shows that adults between 50 and 70 significantly outperform every other age group on tasks involving ambiguous social situations, predicting interpersonal outcomes, identifying when something is being concealed. The gap isn't explained by general intelligence. It's explained by one thing: accumulated experience with exactly those kinds of situations. Gen X is right at the center of that age range now, and according to the research, they're hitting the peak of it. Think about what that means. After decades of being too young to be taken seriously, now beginning to be told they're too old to be relevant. They are, at this exact moment, at the height of their perceptive capacity. The timing is almost ironic. But there's another layer to this, something harder to talk about, something the psychology research names, but that rarely gets acknowledged in everyday conversation. Seeing clearly isn't always comfortable, and it isn't always welcome. There's a name in the NIH research literature for what happens to people with high predictive accuracy. They call it the burden of foresight, the psychological weight of being able to see how things are going to go before other people are ready to see it. The research is clear. This capacity in younger adults correlates with elevated stress, social friction, and a particular kind of isolation, not because these people are withdrawn, but because they're perpetually slightly out of sync with the consensus reality around them. They know something is off before anyone else admits it, and the gap between what they see and what they're supposed to see can be genuinely exhausting to carry. Meet a man named Raymond, 56, spent 30 years in corporate finance. Quiet man, The kind of person who listens more than he talks in any meeting. In 2006, he told his company that the mortgage-backed securities they were investing in were going to fail. Not as a hunch, as a careful reading of patterns he'd been tracking for 18 months. The gap between the presented value of these instruments and what he could see underneath the numbers. Same quality of mismatch he'd been trained to recognize since he was a kid, watching the Ohio steel economy quietly collapse. They didn't listen. He was told he was being too cautious, too negative, that the data didn't support his concerns. 2 years later, the data very much supported his concerns. Nobody called to say he was right. He doesn't need them to. He made peace with that a long time ago. The particular peace that comes from understanding that seeing something clearly and being able to do something about it are two entirely different things. Most Gen X adults made that peace somewhere in their 40s. Not happily, practically. They learned to carry what they knew without expecting the world to receive it on the same timeline they understood it. They learned to be patient, not because they wanted to be, but because impatience about this particular thing had never produced anything useful. And in that patience, something unexpected happened. It became stable, steady, the specific kind of unshockable that can only develop in a person who has already processed what's coming before it arrives. Think about the person in your life who doesn't panic in a crisis, who seems to already have a response ready when everything falls apart, who has a quality of calm that other people find almost inexplicable because they can't see the preparation underneath it. They don't know about the decades of watching. The library of patterns, quiet work of understanding things before they have to be understood under pressure. That person is often, not always, but often, someone who grew up seeing what wasn't supposed to be seen, who learned early that the official story and the real story weren't always the same thing, who spent 50 years filing away the gap between them. That's what this generation built, without being asked to and without being particularly thanked for it. There's one more thing worth saying, and it's the thing that matters most. The knowledge Gen X carries didn't come for free. It came at a cost that rarely gets acknowledged. The cost of a specific kind of innocence. The uncomplicated belief that what was promised would be delivered. Structures built to be trustworthy were actually trustworthy. That certainty was available to anyone who worked hard enough and paid enough attention. That innocence, once it's gone, doesn't come back. You can't unknow what you learned. You can't unsee the gap once you've seen it clearly enough times. You can't go back to the confidence that comes from not yet having been wrong about something that mattered. The years of being dismissed. The relationships that ended because the perception gap was too wide to cross. Professional environments that rewarded enthusiasm over accuracy and then quietly came around to the accuracy later without saying so. All of that is part of what this generation knows. Not just the insight, but the cost of having it in a world that wasn't always ready for it. And here's the part worth holding on to. Gen X is now at the age where what they know and what the world needs are finally starting to match. Not perfectly, not loudly, but for the first time, the patience that was required to carry this knowledge through decades of a world that wasn't quite ready for it is beginning to pay dividends that are visible. In the people who come to them for advice, in the crises they navigate without losing their composure, in the quiet certainty they carry into rooms where everyone else is still trying to figure out what's happening. The person who sat in that car on the drive home, turning off the engine, sitting in the quiet for a moment before going inside, they know all of this, not as a theory, as a life, everything they've seen, everything they learned by watching when other people were talking, every pattern filed away across 50 years of paying attention. It was building toward this. Toward the years when what they understand finally meets what the world is ready to receive. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing. If you found something here that felt like it was describing your life, if something in this script landed somewhere true, then you know exactly what this channel is for. Ecology that takes the full weight of a real human life seriously. No shortcuts, no summaries. Just an honest attempt to name what's actually there. That's what this is. There's more of it here if you want it.